It's my pleasure to welcome you to Health News. Thank you for joining us. I am Yomi Otaigbe. In medicine, when some conditions are diagnosed, the layman may wonder, how did this happen? What could be the driving force? These and some other questions might come up. For instance, when you have a minor cut on any part of your body, you expect that the blood from that area, after a few minutes, stop flowing. But did you know that there are few people who would continue to bleed for a long time after a minor cut? We'll find out why this happens. I will bring you the first-hand experience of someone who's battling with this condition known as hemophilia. First, on the news segment, the Senate has approved 1% of the Consolidated Revenue Fund for the financing of the proposed Basic Health Care Provision Fund in the National Health Bill. At the resumption of the consideration of the bill, the lawmakers rejected an initial proposal for 2% to be set aside for the proposed fund. Clause 11.2a turned out to be contentious during the line-by-line consideration of the report. The clause proposed the setting up of a basic health care provision fund with financing from 2% of the Consolidated Revenue Fund.
When you look at the big picture, that is to say that at the end, when you deduct 2% for primary health care scheme, a certain percentage for UBEC, another percentage for ASU, another, at the end of the day, what really is left?
However, the lawmakers were convinced that the proposal is sustainable.
For us to sit down here and argue for the removal of this 2% in a critical sector like health, where international and domestic statistics is saying that Nigeria is performing below par to even including countries that have the beauty of oil as a source of revenue, I think it's a disservice to the people that we represent here.
And moving on to Kwara State, where in order to reduce tragic and harmful impact of fake and counterfeit drugs in the country, the Kwara State Governor, Abdul Fattah Ahmed, has called on the National Assembly and State Houses of Assembly to introduce stiffer penalties for the production and supply of substandard drugs. Governor Ahmed made the call in Ilorin at the opening ceremony of the 86th Annual National Conference of the Pharmaceutical Society of Nigeria. And finally, on the foreign scene, a review of research by a team of scientists from the University of Queensland School of Population Health in the UK has revealed depression is the second most common cause of disability worldwide after back pain. The study compared clinical depression with more than 200 other diseases and injuries as a cause of disability. The World Health Organization says globally, only a small portion of patients have access to treatment. Some people experience depression during a serious medical illness. Others may have depression with life changes, such as a move or the death of a loved one. Still, others have a family history of the condition. Depression is a big public health challenge and a big problem to be reckoned with, but not enough is being done. The WHO recently launched a global mental health action plan to raise awareness among policymakers. Coming up after the break, we'll go into the world of hemophilia.
Every day you invite us to your home. Now we invite you to our homepage. Join Channels TV on social media. Hang out with us on Google Plus/Channels Television. Follow us on Twitter.com/Channels TV_NG. Friend us on Facebook.com/Channels Forum. And don't forget to like our page. That's not all. Subscribe to our YouTube channels, youtube.com/channelsweb, to get constant video updates on news and events in Nigeria and around the world. ChannelsTV.com, the news at your fingertips.
Hemophilia is a bleeding disorder that slows the blood clotting process, and it has two major forms which occur much more commonly in males than in females. Let's hear more from a consultant hematologist with the College of Medicine, University of Lagos, Professor Sulaiman Akomu.
Hemophilia refers to a disease condition where an individual is born with an inability to stop bleeding whenever there's a small cut. Sometimes this individual do actually bleed without any apparent cause for it. It is as a result of a lack of a particular protein in the human blood that is responsible for the blood to clot. There are several proteins in the human blood that participate in the process that makes the blood to clot. But two of those several proteins are actually the major cause of the disease condition that we call hemophilia. There's a protein they call factor 8. There's a protein they call factor 9. These two proteins are usually referred to today as hemophilic proteins because when an individual is born with lack of these proteins, they are usually not able to form clot when there is an injury to the blood vessels. Very unfortunately, majority of people who suffer from this disease are usually not recognized on time, and the disease happens to affect more of males than of females because the gene that code for the synthesis of those proteins happens to be present on what we call X chromosome. Women have 2 of X chromosomes. Males have only 1 X chromosome. The male does not have an opportunity of extra S chromosome that may carry a normal hemophilic gene. So that is why majority of people who suffer from what we call hemophilic bleeding are usually males. Very unfortunately, I see the tip of the iceberg. I am up there where the children are being born are out there, and our midwives, because a lot of children, traditional birth attendants, are the people that are actually taking deliveries of our children. I'm not the one. It is when we are able to go out there and let people know, to recognize that there is a differential of prolonged bleeding that we call hemophilia.
Okay, let's talk about the bleeding. Is it just about bruises and injuries, and how mild or severe can it be?
Hemophilic bleeding could be mild, could be moderate, could be severe. Now, the severe hemophilic bleeding, you don't want to talk about it because you have a severe hemophilic bleeding, the patient usually die. Hemophilic bleeding that is severe, an individual bleeds into the brain. That's a big problem. If you bleed into the eye, you could lose the eye. It's a major bleeding. You bleed into the throat, you could compress the trachea, and individual can choke and die. These are what we refer to as major hemophilic bleeding. Now, the other hemophilic bleeding, you could bleed into the soft tissue and hematoma. You just see the thigh, swell up. That will hematoma. But you can also bleed into what you call joints, what we call hemarthrosis. And majority of patients with hemophilia actually bleed into the joints and damage the joints and make them to become crippled.
So aside from the bleeding, are there other signs that can point that a person is hemophiliac?
Yes, particularly when they are moderate to severe hemophiliac. You can identify hemophiliac right from birth, because once the baby is separated from the mother and you sever that joint, that link between the baby and the mother, what you call the umbilical cord, the stump continues to bleed for too long a time, and you must begin to suspect. Usually because it affects the males. Whenever you circumcise a male child, please watch out for episode of prolonged bleeding. If there is prolonged bleeding, you must begin to suspect. Now, majority of hemophilia should be diagnosed, when they are in their age 1 to 2, age that they crawl about, a small fall. You see the child developing a swelling of the ankle, a swelling of the elbow, or he has a small fall, and then he bites the tongue, he continues to bleed, for a prolonged period of time. These are the signs that this child might actually be an hemophiliac. And any child that bleeds as a result of a minor fall, you must have to rule out hemophilic bleeding.
This issue of diagnosis is a challenge in Nigeria, and it seems that most doctors don't even know how to recognize hemophilia. Majority
of patients that get to secondary healthcare facilities, it's unfortunate that it's like when we leave medical school, we forget about the subject of hemophilia as if it was never taught in medical school. I really don't understand why, in fact, majority of our colleagues do not remember that there's a word called a medical condition called hemophilia that is a differential diagnosis to hemorrhagic bleeding. All they are thinking about is vitamin K deficiency, vitamin C deficiency, rather than thinking of a very common inherited condition that is a lifelong thing, and this treatment is usually demand that you recognize it, because it's a replacement therapy that it requires. Let's talk about treatments. What options are there for hemophiliacs? Very unfortunately, there's nothing that you can call a cure, except you do what they call a gene therapy, because it's an inherited condition, there's an abnormal gene. If it is possible to do a gene therapy, which is a technology for tomorrow, then we can be talking about a cure. For today, what is available for treatment of hemophilia is replacement therapy. This individual lacks factor 8, gives factor 8. It's as simple as that. Now, the source of factor 8 to be given is usually the issue, because it's a protein that the body synthesizes and is supposed to be present in the plasma. So, for now, in our practice, we extract other people's plasma and we have to transfuse when an individual is bleeding. Or we collect those plasma, we freeze it away, what we call fresh frozen plasma, and we keep away until we get a patient who is bleeding and required, and we will transfuse it. To ensure that somebody does not bleed, and to ensure that a child is able to go to school, is able to do a lot of running around in school without having to bleed, it is important that we get to that stage where we can prophylactically infuse our children who are hemophiliac with hemophilic protein. Very unfortunately, that is still a plan for the future, because the source of this protein and the cost implications of having to do this is something enormous, and we need to be talking about it to stakeholders, our government, the manufacturers, how we can do it the way it is done elsewhere, where an hemophilic child just grow up like a child who is not an hemophiliac. Okay, so should we be waiting for prolonged bleeding or bleeding into the joints before we diagnose hemophilia? Is there any blood test, or can blood tests actually bring out this hemophilia earlier? You don't go out there and start to screen for an hemophilic patient. However, it is possible to screen women who may be carrier of hemophilic gene. In fact, there's a need for that project, for us to be able to prove to Nigerians and our medical colleagues that hemophilic gene in our population cannot be different, that is prevalence of hemophilic gene in our population cannot be different from prevalence of hemophilic gene in other populations, because the prevalence of hemophilic gene in several populations have been studied and appears to be constant among all human populations. No racial discrimination with hemophilic gene. So while we are not having a lot of patients with hemophilia in our register, it needs to be explained. But I know that a lot of them are dying, a lot of them are not recognized, and people will give you stories. By the time you talk to a number of our patients, they will give you stories, how a number of their uncles and uncles didn't know that this was happening. So the screening that can be done is to do a screening for who can be a carrier woman.
Thank you so much for speaking with us. Talk about someone who really knows where the shoe pinches when it comes to hemophilia, and Temitokwe Adioshun, an IT consultant, minced no words in saying being a hemophiliac is challenging.
I've always known I'm hemophiliac because I'm the third hemophiliac in a family of 3 hemophiliacs. I'm actually the last born, and I haven't had 2 hemophiliacs before me, and I haven't had a little knowledge of the disorder. When my parents had another male child, they were pretty much looking out for it. So I got diagnosed rather early in life.
So if we have challenges diagnosing hemophilia in Nigeria, how did your parents get to know?
They were lucky because when my first brother, who is hemophiliac, had an injury, he had a severe cut to his chin, and they were in the hospital. Somewhere along the line, someone somewhere, actually specifically, it was actually Professor Olukoye Ransom Kuti, that had diagnosed him and ended up assisting them with knowledge, getting them to understand the disorder.
Okay, so how has it been living with hemophilia?
Challenging, to say the least. Being a hemophiliac, you really don't feel like there's something wrong with you. It's not like malaria, for example, where you can feel there's something wrong with your body. Being a hemophiliac, you feel normal until you try to live your life normally. And then you face consequences of being a hemophiliac. So, you know how it is, being a male child, growing up, you want to be like every other male child, you want to play, you want to run around. Every one of such activities ends up resulting in injuries, injuries that are difficult to handle.
Tell us about 1 or 2 of those experiences.
There was a day I returned from school, and my siblings fell asleep shortly after we returned, and well, I couldn't sleep. I wasn't inclined to sleep in the afternoon when I was much younger. So I sat down just gazing at the balcony, and by the time everybody woke up and I wanted to stand up, I realized I had bled into my knee, and that was a case of a spontaneous bleed.
How old were you then?
Say I probably was around 7, 8, thereabouts. I'd had a spontaneous bleed. It was my most severe spontaneous bleed because it's happened rather very rapidly, as in the rate of bleed was high. My knee ballooned out. The pain was excruciating. It was the first time that I actually had morphine administered for pain, because I couldn't sleep for 3 days stretch because of the pain. The second was when I was circumcised. I was actually circumcised as an adult. I wasn't circumcised at infancy because of the experience with my 2 older brothers. By the time I was being circumcised, of course, cultural requirements, religious expectation, and all of that, we had prepared, we had acquired sufficient quantity of factors from abroad. My parents had acquired sufficient quantity of factors from abroad, and we went in basic minor surgery, and 2 days into the circumcision, I was stable, I was doing good because I had factors available. But 2 days into the after the operation, there was a major power failure at the hospital, and then there was no water. And then the normal cleaning and dressing couldn't take place. And then I got an infection and I started bleeding. That was, even up till date, that had been my most severe external bleed. My genital was hanging in a Petri dish, and the Petri dish was filling and was being emptied like every 45 minutes to 1 hour. And the doctors tried all they could. I exhausted the factors I had with me. The doctors tried all they could. They tried stitching the blood vessel just to close it, but none of that would help. My PCV pre-op was 42, and then at the point I dropped to about 8. That was before I eventually passed out. Eventually, I was transferred to the General Hospital Lagos, which had the capacity to produce FFP. Till I recovered, essentially I was sustained on FFP, fresh frozen plasma. I was sustained on fresh frozen plasma and whole blood transfusion till I spent close to 3 months in the hospital during that episode before I eventually was able to recover. Yeah. So basically, if you say, okay, what has it been like? It's been a whole world of pain, bleeding into the joints, bleeding into the muscle. My right leg is deformed because I bled into my calf muscle when I was in secondary school. And well, people would sometimes see me and think it was as a result of polio, but it was as a result of a bleed. Right now, I have to use a cane because I have significant damage to my hip, both my knees, my ankle. I also have some degree of joint degradation with both of my elbows.
All of this, I would say, are enough challenges for anybody. And but what would you say are the ripple effects of hemophilia?
It affects every bit of your life. It affects a lot of life decisions you make, where you live, the choice of your career. I, for example, wanted to study engineering. I wanted to study petroleum engineering. But when my brother, who at the time was a mechanical engineering student, had learned of my intent to study petroleum engineering, had simply told me, see, my brother, I'm an engineering student, and one of our courses is engineering drawing. And when making those drawings, you stand. And in some cases, you could stand for hours. Your joints cannot bear that. So I ended up resigning from studying petroleum engineering, and well, I studied computer science instead. Love it or leave it. The older we get, the more joint challenges we face, even for a normal individual. Right now, I probably have the joint of a 75-year-old. So what's it going to be like by the time I'm 75 years old? So in choosing choosing a spouse, an hemophiliac person definitely doesn't want to marry a carrier, because the risk of bearing hemophiliac children, both male and female, then exists.
How have you been managing this condition?
Management of the condition has varied for me over time. Growing up between childhood and adulthood, I've had to manage it mostly by resting. Practice what we call complete bed rest, and then applying ice to the site of bleed per time, since most of the bleed are to the joints and muscle spaces anyway. And that isn't a very efficient means of management. For example, growing up, frequently I've had to spend weeks, sometimes months, just lying down and waiting to get better. But ultimately, the best means of managing hemophilia is using factor 8 concentrates.
So what kind of support is there for hemophiliacs in Nigeria?
Presently, those of us affected have come together to form a support group called the Hemophilia Foundation of Nigeria. So together, we are improving support for persons living with hemophilia and other types of bleeding disorder in Nigeria. As at today, we have about 350 members on our list. However, that is just the tip of the iceberg, because the World Federation of Hemophilia Statistics shows that hemophilia prevalence in any society is about 1 hemophilia in every 10,000 male births. And a research was also conducted back at UCH several years back that ended up agreeing with that same data. So, with that proportion, you expect to have about 12,000 to 15,000 hemophiliac persons living in Nigeria.
Hemophilia is a lifelong disorder, but with proper treatment and self-care, most people with the condition can maintain an active, productive lifestyle. That's a wrap on the show for this week. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us on Health News. I'm Yomi Otaigwe.